Beautiful. Jesus, love, and the human condition. So when I first came up with this title, immediately a pretty well-known story from Universalist history came to mind. I think many of you have heard it before, but I have to share it again. It's from probably the most famous Universalist preacher in history, way in the beginning, Hosea Ballou, who preached around New Hampshire primarily in the early 19th century, 1800s. And this story is about what was very common at the time, that these were small, tiny little congregations who couldn't have a big church and afford their own ministers. So these itinerant ministers would just go from village to village each Sunday and expect to be paid and preach in these little congregations. And sometimes they would join up because all denominations were the same. So in this case, it was Hosea Ballou, the Universalist minister, and a Baptist preacher in town. They preached their sermons, did whatever they do after the service, and then they got on their horses and were riding to the next town to be there for the next week. Well, what do preachers do when they're riding horses through New Hampshire? You argue theology, of course. So that's what they were doing. And at one point, the Baptist preacher looked over and said, "Brother Ballou, if I were a Universalist and feared not the fires of hell, I could hit you over the head, steal your horse and saddle, and ride away, and I'd still go to heaven." Hosea Ballou, without missing a beat, looked over at him and said, "If you were a Universalist, the idea would never have come to you." So the point of this story is that, frankly, Universalism was and is a very radical idea. There was no need for a threat of hell. It's all about love. And if you think about that, throughout Christian history, if love had been the focus on as much as sin, death, and damnation, the world would probably be a very different place today. So frankly, the story represents the two major theologies that were going on at the time in New England. The Baptist minister represents a religion of control, using fear, death, and eternal damnation as the motivators. Theology, frankly, comes from the fall of humanity and the Hebrew creation story, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. It's the basis of the human condition, and it's explained as original sin. Humans from the very beginning, we're told, wanted too much. God told them, you live in this beautiful garden, just be at peace with that. Don't go near this tree of the tree of knowledge. But they wanted to be like God. They wanted the knowledge of good and evil. So, of course, they ate of it. They disobeyed God, and they proved unworthy of paradise. And so from that point on, humans are, and in the theology that the confessional that I grew up in, the quote was, by nature, sinful and unclean, unquote. And only the threat of eternal damnation in hell could keep us in line. Well, Ballou, the Universalist, represents the alternative, which seems to be what Jesus was preaching about in that passage from Matthew, in my opinion. Jesus was talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees, which were these two powerful sects in Judaism at the time, which were obsessed with the laws of Moses. There were these myriad rules of behavior which deemed important to be right with God, which was really the purpose. In Judaism, it wasn't about hell. They didn't really have the concept of hell, but rather being in God's good grace, or you were going to face punishment of some sort. Jesus said their focus, the Sadducees and Pharisees, on do's and don'ts of the laws missed the point completely. That if we always did the most loving thing and thought in the most loving ways, we would not need these laws at all. It's very, very radical thinking today, as well as in that time, which is one of the reasons they wanted to kill him. And now just a little bit of a digression. This wasn't just Christianity. Almost all creation stories out there have a similar theme of a fall from paradise to explain the human condition, to explain why there's suffering in the world. And often it's blamed on some sort of trickster. In this case, it was Satan, the snake, in this Jewish creation story. They didn't really have Satan, but it was the snake, and Christians named it Satan later, which that's how the Christians then adopted it. And it sets up this dichotomy of our evil animal instincts and our good nature. Again, universally, the human condition seems to be the results of instincts we can't resist. You've probably heard the expression many times, it's in our nature, it's in my genes, it's in our genes. This is how humans are. That's just the human condition. Well, in the early 20th century, of course, we had Freud, the founder of modern psychology. And although Freud moved us away from the idea that we're just pawns in this galactic chess game between God and Satan, there was still the concept of evil or bad behavior coming from animal instincts in his theories. So basically, and those of you that are into psychology are going to probably crucify me, but I'm going to summarize Freud into the two basic concepts of death and life, or death and love. The death, the way he thought of it, is all these destructive behaviors that we are innately driven to because of our animalistic nature. And then love or life was seen as the consciousness. It was this loving, life-affirming behaviors that we should try to use to push the animal behaviors to the background or deeper within, or at least recognize them and resolve them. So that was the 20th century with Freud. But then I kept working on this sermon, and if you're going to write a sermon called Love, Jesus, and the Human Condition, you're going to Google human condition at some point. And there's actually a domain name, humancondition.com. It opens up, and it's got this kind of very gaudy looking screen that says the World Transformation Movement. So it kind of caught my eye. And I read further and further, and something in this just really intrigued me. So this is Jeremy Griffith, the last quote I read. He's the founder of the World Transformation Movement. And he has this really interesting slant on this that I wanted to share with you this morning. But I don't know if many people know who he is. So Jeremy Griffith was born in 1945 in the Australian outback. And as I read, it sounds like he grew up probably homeschooled. It was set in this family of just this loving environment where they really fostered his inquisitive nature, and there's pictures of him as a little boy documenting what butterflies he's seen that day. So that's the kind of person he was. And he grew up to be a biologist and an author. And he first came to worldwide fame in his 20s because he was concerned about the Tasmanian tiger. The last Tasmanian tiger anyone ever saw was in a zoo somewhere in Australia in 1935. And so on his own, and there's pictures of him in this bicycle with his dog on the back and his canoe, he went out in trying to find the Tasmanian tiger, ended up getting a lot of support worldwide, and they did a real scientific research, and eventually it resulted in the Tasmanian tiger being declared extinct. But that's his original claim to fame. Well, he dedicated the rest of his life really to, well, he also had a furniture business, but I'm not going to go into that. He's quite an entrepreneur. But he really dedicated his life, and this is what he's about now, into this biological explanation to the dilemma of the human condition. Remember, he's a biologist. So he wants to explain, how do we explain our species' extraordinary capacity for what has been called good and evil? Griffin is driven by two questions. The first one is, I'm quoting from the website. Even in our everyday behavior, why, when the ideas of life are to be, the ideals of life are to be cooperative, selfless, and loving, are we so ruthlessly competitive and selfish that human life has become all but unbearable and our planet nearly destroyed? And that's followed with the second question. How could we humans possibly be considered good when all the evidence seems to unequivocally indicate that we are a deeply flawed, bad, even evil species? Heavy questions. So I'll jump right to the answer and then unpack how we get there. He explains the human condition as a psychosis. So let me kind of go through this. Yes, I see the eyes in the room popping open. He basically said, he doesn't agree with Freud. He thinks that the dichotomy of animal versus conscious drivers doesn't make sense. He said the idea that we're programmed by our genes to dominate others. We have this preoccupation with sexual conquest, particularly that's what explains why men behave so abominably. We want this big house because we're innately territorial, and fighting in war is just this deep-rooted combative animal nature. He says that's kind of hogwash. He says it's too simplistic. And then he gives this kind of poetic answer to that. He says, words that we use to describe our human behavior are things like this: egocentric, arrogant, depressed, pessimistic, artificial, hateful, cynical. These are all the bad words. But then there's these good ones at the same time: inspired, optimistic, brilliant. He says, you have to take the whole package as one. It's not this versus that. He said, all these words recognize the involvement of our species' fully conscious thinking mind. So he says they demonstrate that there is a psychological dimension to our behavior, that we don't suffer from a genetic opportunism-driven animal condition, but a conscious mind-based, psychologically troubled human condition. Okay, that's a lot of words. Let me repeat it. A conscious mind-based, psychologically troubled human condition. It's not coming from our genes. It's just in our mind. So back to the reading that I started with. We humans have cooperative, selfless, and loving moral instincts, the voice or expression of which we call our conscience, which is the complete opposite of competitive, selfish, and aggressive instincts. So he goes on to say, our distant ape ancestors must have lived cooperatively, selfless, and lovingly. Otherwise, how would we have acquired both sets of instincts? Remember, he's coming from a biological perspective. And he points to the observations, particularly of the bonobo species in ape that's currently living in that kind of an Eden-like cooperative, collaborative harmony, and anthropological findings say that this has been going on for over 5 million years. So finally, Griffith says, so saying our competitive and aggressive behavior comes from savage competitive and aggressive instincts in us is simply not true, that it's really just part of our psychological makeup. So he says that's really good news, because actually you can heal from a psychological psychosis, right? So then he goes on to explain this a little bit. I know there's a lot of detail here. But he said, imagine a predicament faced by an animal whose life has always been controlled by its instincts and suddenly developing a conscious mind. Because if we don't do that, we will very quickly see how that animal would develop a psychologically troubled, competitive, and aggressive condition like we suffer from. So to unpack even further, he gives this great example. He talks about the storks that migrate from the coast, the southern tip of Africa, all the way to Europe every year. And they've done this for millennia, right? This is what they do every year, and they come back down. And they just do it by instinct. They all seem to know where they're going. We said, what if one of the storks achieved consciousness? And we'll call this stork Adam. And so Adam's going along with the other geese, and he looks down, and there's this beautiful island out in the Atlantic that has full of apple trees. And he's thinking to himself, why am I going all the way to Europe with these dolts? I might as well just go to this island here and live a good life and wait for them to come back down in the fall. So that's what he does. And so in this illustration, then what do the other geese do? First, they'd like look over their shoulder, they'd honk at them, they'd probably dive bomb them, they'd kind of like get in line. These are, this is what we always do. You're breaking it up. Who's going to be in the formation with you? And so that's how he thinks of it in our heads. It's not like Freud, where it said, yes, we have these animal instincts and we need to work on them and suppress them and try to be human. Griffith is saying it's all human. We've developed all of this from our ancestry. And so what's going on in our mind is this little geese war that we're conflicted with each other inside. And then this is the behavior that we see out in the universe. So I thought it was an interesting theory. So I want to give you an alternative to Freud this morning. And essentially, I've given you 3 points of view. on the human condition. The Baptist preacher, which is the classic Christian theology, Freud, which is more of a psychological perspective, and then Griffith with this biological perspective. But ultimately, we're going to go back to Jesus. So Jesus's radical message was tapped into this understanding. All we really need in life is food, water, shelter, security, and love. Love. Forget about the boogeyman. It's not a dichotomy of good versus evil, of conscious versus instinct. The real dichotomy is love, or the absence of love. Matthew 22 again. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So our modern Unitarian Universalist theology, in my opinion, would put it this way. We'd substitute God for love with a capital L. Love is a mighty and strong positive force in the universe. We should dedicate our hearts, spirits, and minds to this love above all else. And to do that, we need to love ourselves first, so that we can love our neighbors, all our neighbors, likewise. Okay, but we find it difficult to live into this theology, don't we? Why do we continue to have conflict in our society, but particularly in our fellowships and our congregations? I always say we should do better than most people, but we're human. We have conflicts. I think of it this way. When someone does or says something in our fellowships that we find irritating, do we immediately respond with, what would be the most loving thing to do? Or do we react probably a little bit more, less than endearing? Or what if you're the person doing that behavior? If we have a tendency to criticize others or unload our pain and frustration onto others, are we giving love to our neighbors in the way we would love ourselves? Always living into love is tough. Like the goose in the story, we will feel pushback. It feels so good to lash out, doesn't it? We may even feel like we appear weak or a fool to others whom we want to impress. But at the end of the day, with whom are we angry? Who are we trying to impress? Why are we so competitive, selfish, and aggressive at times? Lean into our gift of consciousness and the ability to love and to be loved. Lean into the universalist love of Hosea Ballou and live free from fear and damnation. I heard a quote, love is everywhere, like oxygen. So people just breathe. By doing so, we can begin to heal our psychosis and transform the world. May it be so. Amen.